Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf mostly involves a discussion about what happens when you have two residents of a chutzner or mavoy that are not joining the Erev Chatzeros and not joining the Shitufim Mavois. What are their rights and what are their abilities? Later in the daf, we'll get to a discussion about an inheritance. If somebody who was a member of the chutzner died on Shabbos or just before Shabbos, and his land, his property, is bequeathed to another person, can that person take his place and do bittul rishos, or can they not do bittul rishos? So we're discussing bittul rishos here, and as we had seen earlier, we saw a Mishnah that lists off a number of cases. And the last thing it said was that two residents of a chutzner cannot both receive rishos, meaning if you have other people who want to do bittul rishos, two residents, they cannot both receive it, assuming these two residents did not join in an Erev. Since they're both separate, even if they receive everyone else's rishos, it won't solve the problem, because you still will have two owners in the chutzner or the mavoy, and therefore it'll be bad news. Now the Gemara asks that this is a halach we've seen already, so why do I need to see this again? The Gemara says that it's teaching me an extra chiddush. We may have thought that the only reason that two people can't receive rishos is because it'll belong to two people now, and that won't help anything. But let's say one of those two people wants to be makna his rishos to the other one, and then you'll have only one person having it, so that would be okay. But we've actually already seen that wouldn't be okay, because the second to last person to have rishos, who received rishos from everyone else and is giving it to the final person, doesn't have a right to give over everybody else's rishos. So the Gemara says you may have thought that if the other people who first gave their rishos gave the second to last guy permission to give what he has received from them over to the last person, the one who's going to have everybody's rishos in the end, should be allowed to do it, because they've given him permission to do that. The Gemara says the chiddush here is that he can't do it even if they allow him. That means, let's say you have 5 people in the chutzner. 2 of them did not join in an Erev. So the other 3 say, you know what, we're giving over our rishos to you. They're left with 2 now. One of those 2 says, okay, now I'm going to give my rishos plus everything that I've received over to the last guy, and he's going to be able to carry. And the first 3 guys actually allow him to do that. Still doesn't work, because the rishos that he received from them has no purpose, has no function. It doesn't do anything. When he received it, it didn't create any heter. And therefore, he's giving a non-functional rishos over to the last person. That doesn't count, and therefore that last person is not allowed to carry either. Okay, now the Gemara opens up a new discussion. It begins with a question that was asked from Abaye to Rabbah. Abaye asks, what happens if you have 5 people living in a chutzner together? The number 5 is lav dafka, and one of them forgot to join the Erev Chatzeros, and now he wants to do bittul rishos. So now he wants to be mevatel his rishos to the 4 other people who live there. Does he have to be mevatel to each of the 4 of them individually, or does he only have to be mevatel to one of them? Then he no longer has any rights in the chutzner. He's out. The other 4 joined in Erev Chatzeros, so there's no problem. So that's the question. Does he have to be mevatel? Does he have to be mevatel individually to each of the other members, or can he be mevatel to the group? Now, Rabbah answered him, and he said, no, he said he has to be mevatel to each person individually. It's not enough to be mevatel to the group, even though they have an Erev Chatzeros. The Gemara is going to ask on this by quoting a lengthy brisa. The brisa is confusing and has a number of cases in it. We'll have a raya from one of the cases. We're going to need to analyze some of the other cases in order to see if the raya makes sense. We'll reject the raya, we'll restore the raya, and then we'll get to Abaye's pshat in the brisa, and the Gemara will wind up deciding that Abaye's pshat doesn't really make sense. Then the Gemara is going to work through the brisa step by step and see what all the cases there, what is the chiddush of each of them. So first of all, the brisa. So the brisa says as follows: you have a number of people together in a chutzner. Some of them made an Erev, some of them did not make an Erev, and we have a list of 6 cases. So the first case is where you have one person who did not join an Erev and one person who did join an Erev. So the halacha is the one person who did not join is allowed to be mevatel his rishos to the one person who did join the Erev. Now the Gemara is going to ask right away, what do you mean one person joined an Erev? Who did he make an Erev with? The Gemara will say there must be that there was a third person here, and he's not mentioned, and the second and third person, they made an Erev Chatzeros between them, and there was one person who didn't join them. And this is actually Abaye's raya. This is the raya. It says that the one person is allowed to be mevatel his rishos to one other person, but there's a third person here who joined an erev with that one, and he doesn't have to be mevatel his rishos to the third person, only to the second person. So you see, not like what Rab has said, you see, he only has to be mevatel his rishos to one of the people who made an erev chatzeres, not to all of them. And that's going to be the raya. Let's first finish the rest of the brisa. The brisa then says further, let's say you have two people who did make an erev chatzeres, now they are considered to be one group. They are allowed to be mevatel their rishos to one person who did not make an erev. Right? So if you have one who didn't join an erev, he's allowed to receive the rishos of everyone else. Like we've seen, one person can receive rishuyos, he can receive bittul rishos from others. He will then be the other person who's allowed to carry. Now the brisa goes to what happens if two people didn't make an erev. Two people forgot to join an erev chatzeres. So those two people can give over their rishos to another two people who did make an erev chatzeres. Those two people will then be allowed to carry. They already are joined in an erev. They're considered like one individual. As one individual, they're allowed to. Now, if you have one person who's left, and obviously he either made an erev or he didn't make an erev, if there's another individual there, so then he's allowed to receive their rishos as well. So two people are allowed to give over their rishos as long as the receiver of rishos is one unit, either a single individual or two people who created an erev. Now we have cases where you cannot transfer rishos, and they are as follows. Let's say you have one person who made an erev. Obviously, the Gemara is going to say one person made an erev. It has to be that there's two people who made an erev. It doesn't make sense otherwise. But you have an erev. They are not allowed to give over rishos to a person who did not make an erev. What's the problem? You have two people who made an erev, and one of them will give over his rishos to somebody else who didn't make an erev. That means only one of the rishuyos are being given to him. There's still going to be another rishos that's left behind. Although there's two people who together joined an erev, if only one of those two gives over his rishos individually, that doesn't bring the other person's rishos. If they come as a group, so then they're allowed to give over their rishos as a group to the one individual. But if only one of the two who made an erev gives it over, it won't solve the problem of the fact that there's multiple owners, because those two people who made an erev, one of them is giving over his rishos, the other is not. So that won't solve the problem. Similarly, you can't have two people that made an erev give over rishos to two people who did not make an erev. First of all, for the same reason. And second of all, two people can never receive an erev, because you'll end up with two people can never receive rishos, because you'll never have a situation where there is only one ownership of this entire chatzer. You'll have two people owning it now. Similarly, two people who did not make an erev cannot give over rishos to two people who did not make an erev. Again, same problem. Two people can never receive rishos, because that won't solve the problem at all. It won't get us anywhere. So now, so what we are left with here is Abaye has his raya, and the fact that one person who did not make an erev is allowed to give over his rishos to one person who did make an erev, and that person obviously has a third person here that he made an erev with, but the brisa says he only has to give over his rishos to one of them and not to both of them. It's a raya against Rabbah. So Rabbah says, no, actually, if both of those people who made the erev are alive, then he would have to give over rishos to both of them individually. This case is where one of them died. There was an erev made, and then one of them died, and therefore he's gone. That's why he doesn't have to receive rishos, and that's the case over here. Now, Abaye says back, not so fast. I have a problem on that. You can't tell me that it's referring to where there was one and died. That's what we mean when we say one person that made an erev. By the way, it fits in the language. One person who made an erev, obviously he made an erev with somebody, but that person's not around anymore. But Abaye says they can't be, because in the end of the brisa, when we said the list of the people who cannot give over rishos, we said one person who made an erev cannot give over his rishos to one person who did not make an erev. And the reason was because the one person who made an erev is really two people, and one of them is trying to give over his rishos. We said he can't, because there'll still be rishos left to the one person who's not giving it. But hold on a second. Rabbi is telling me that the person who's not, that the one other person who's there, that he's gone. He died. He made an erev and then he died. So what's the problem now? Let the one person who's left give over his rishos. Why does the brisa say that you can't do that? Obviously, he didn't die. Well, if he didn't die in the sefer, then he didn't die in the reisha. So Rabbi says back, not necessarily. He didn't die in the sefer, and in the reisha he died. Well, we're not impressed. It doesn't have to be the same case. And now Rabbi says, actually, I'll bring a raya to me from this brisa, because if you look carefully, there's a case of two people who did not join an erev are allowed to give over their rishos to two people who did join an erev. You see, but they have to give it over to both of them. You can't give it over to just one of them. So you see, I'm right. You have to give over to each person individually who created the erev. You can't just give it over to one of the people in the erev itself. Now, how's Abaye going to explain that? So Abaye says, no, when it says you give it over to two people who made an erev, it doesn't mean to both of them. It means you give it over to either of the two people who made the erev. Gemara says, well, 1 second, that's not true. Everywhere else in the Brisa, when we said you're giving it over to one of the two people who made an Erev, we said one. We didn't say two. We called them one, and we know that there has to be another one there. So Gemara says, yeah, Abaye's pshat is actually doesn't fit with the rest of the Brisa, and therefore it's not. It's a kasha. It's a little difficult. Now the Gemara works through each of the 7 cases of the Brisa, and the Gemara wants to know why is each case a chiddush at all. All these halachas we've seen, each of them has to be chiddush, at least in this Brisa specifically, and it has to be chiddush according to Abaye's understanding and according to Rabba's understanding. So we're going to have to come up with a lot of different chiddushim here. So the Gemara says as follows. The first case of the Brisa is that you have one person didn't make an Erev, and one person who did make an Erev. Then the one person who did not make an Erev is allowed to be mevatel his reshus to the one person who did make an Erev. So what is the chiddush of this? So according to Abaye, this is a very major chiddush. This is the raya that Rabba was wrong. You only have to be mevatel to one person, because obviously when it says one person didn't, when it says one person made an Erev, that person must have made an Erev with some third person who's not mentioned, but you only have to be mevatel reshus to him, not to somebody else. That was the raya against Abaye. According to Rabba, this is the one, when it says you're mevatel to one person, it means it was the third person and that person died. The chiddush is we don't make a gzeira. We allow you to be mevatel to the person who's left alive. We don't make a gzeira that we shouldn't let you do that if it's a case of where one person was there and he died, lest you come to be mevatel reshus in a case where there are two people that are both still alive. You may get confused between where one died and they're both still alive. They're both still alive. You have to be mevatel to both of them. Maybe I should make a gzeira that you can't be mevatel to just one, even if the other one died. The Mishnah is telling you that's not true. You don't have to make such a gzeira. Okay, next case in the Brisa said that if you have two people who made an Erev together, they are allowed to be mevatel reshus to one person who did not make an Erev. So here you have the same chiddush according to both Abaye and to Rava, that the one person who didn't make an Erev, who did not join the Erev, is not knast. We do not penalize him for not joining the Erev, and we allow him to receive the reshus even of the other two people who made an Erev. Okay, the next case was that two people who did not make an Erev are allowed to be mevatel the reshus to two people who did make an Erev. So according to Rabbah, this is a very important case. This is the proof that you have to be mevatel to both of them individually. You can't be mevatel to just one of them since they're joined in an Erev. According to Abaye, what's the chiddush over here? The chiddush over here is that you're allowed to be, is that two people who both didn't join the Erev are allowed to be mevatel their reshus. We don't say there's a gzeira that if you let two people be mevatel, then maybe two people will end up receiving reshus from others, and they'll think that works, and that doesn't work. We know two people can't receive reshus because you'll still end up with two owners. You won't have one single entity owning the entire chutzner. Okay, the fourth case of what's permitted is that two people who did not make an Erev are allowed to be mevatel their reshus to one person who did not make an Erev. Here Abaye and Rava and Rabba both have the same chiddush. The chiddush is that we don't say, hey, look what happened here. All three people didn't make an Erev. Maybe we shouldn't allow them to get out of this. They should be stuck with a problem, because if we allow them to be mevatel reshus and then they're going to be allowed to carry here, people will forget all about Erev Chatzeres. So we don't say that. We don't say gzeira shalot tishtakach. We still allow bittul reshus even though nobody made any Erev whatsoever. Okay, fifth case in the Brisa was that you have one person who made an Erev, which obviously means that there was another person there with him. One person who made an Erev with some mystery third person who's not mentioned, but that one person who made an Erev is not allowed to be mevatel his reshus to the one person who did not make an Erev. The reason we said to this one was, according to Abaye, this is a very important case, because this was the proof that that third person who's not mentioned is still alive. Because the reason that he can't be mevatel is that there are two people who joined an Erev, one is mentioned, one is not, and the one person who's there, the one person who's mentioned cannot be mevatel his reshus to the one person who didn't join the Erev, because of the mystery third person who's not mentioned that will not have been mevatel his reshus, and therefore there will still be two owners left in this chutzner. Now, this is the proof that this entire brisa, when it says one person who made an Erev, means that one person is still alive. He made an Erev with another person who's still alive, even though he's not mentioned. According to Rabbah, that's not much of a chiddush, because we don't need that. That was not true in the first half of the Reisha, in the first half of the Brisa. So why is this case mentioned at all? So the Gemara says this is just the inverse. It's the it's the reverse of the first case in the Brisa, and it's mentioned just for a parallel, symmetrical type of Brisa. The first case was where you had one person who did not make an Erev and one person who did make an Erev, where the person who did not is being Mevatel his Rishus of the person who did. Here's the opposite. The person who did is being Mevatel his Rishus of the person who did not, and the halacha said he's not allowed to do that. Okay, fine. Now, the last two cases where you had two people on each side, you have two people who made an Erev being Mevatel Rishus to the two people who did not make an Erev, and two people who did not make an Erev being Mevatel Rishus to two people who did not make an Erev. Both of those don't work. What's the chiddush of these? The chiddush in both of these is that you have two people trying to receive an Erev. Two people cannot receive an Erev. The chiddush is that, first of all, even if one of them is Mevatel his Rishus to the other, it's no good. And the last case is even if one of them is Mevatel his Rishus to the other, and when he originally received the Rishus, he was told that he's allowed to do that by the other owners of the yard, still it's no good, even though he's made a shliach. It's no good, as we said in the beginning of this Gemara, in the beginning of the Daf. Since the rishus that he received is useless, it doesn't permit anybody to carry. Him giving it over doesn't create any heter. Okay, that brings this discussion to a close. And now the Gemara opens a new discussion about what happens when somebody dies and you're inheriting the land and the rights to the chatzar. So the Gemara spells out the question. Rava asked Rav Nachman, what happens if somebody, one of the members of the chatzar, dies on Shabbos and he had not made an Erev Chatzeris? So we know that the rule is that if you forgot to join the Erev Chatzeris, you can always do Bittul Rishus. However, this person died without doing Bittul Rishus. The question is, can his inheritor, who now has his property, can he do Bittul Rishus? Do we say only the person who could have made the Erev Chatzeris in the beginning of Shabbos, he can do Bittul Rishus? Or even somebody who never had the option of doing an Erev Chatzeris, he could still do Bittul Rishus because he's considered to be his father's estate. He's part of the Rishus that he inherited. He steps right into those shoes, and whatever rights that original person had, he has, as an inheritor, gets those same rights. So the Gemara brings two brises to try to prove this. The first brise is as follows. It says that there are the halacha at the beginning of Shabbos is what stays for the entire Shabbos. If something was usher in the beginning of Shabbos, it stays usher. If something was mutter in the beginning of Shabbos, it stays mutter, and that's a general rule, except for Bittul Rishus. Bittul Rishus is the only situation where you have something which in the beginning of Shabbos it was usher because you didn't join the Erev Chatzeris, but you could do Bittul Rishus on Shabbos and make it permitted to carry in that Chatzar. Now the Gemara is going to have to give two examples for each. Two examples of something which is mutter in the beginning of Shabbos and stays mutter even though circumstances change, and two examples of things which are us in the beginning of Shabbos and stay usher even though circumstances change. We have to have one for the simple understanding of the brisa and one for what the brisa is including when it says general rule. So the Gemara says that the cases are as follows. The two cases of something which was permitted in the beginning of Shabbos and stay permitted is if you had a Erev Chatzeris between two courtyards, and the way they made the Erev was that there was a doorway or a window between the two yards, and they were able to make the Erev by having the right of a passage through those two, from one yard to the other through that opening, but then that opening got blocked. Now, there is no longer a passageway from the two chatzeres, and therefore that courtyard is, that Erev Chatzeris is batal. You can't say that there's an Erev Chatzeris. You can't get from one to the other. There's still a question of usage though, because the holes in the walls are jointly owned. So because it was permitted to use the holes in the walls at the beginning of Shabbos, it stays mutter in the end of Shabbos. What's the second case? If you had a mavoy that needed a tikkun, as we went at the beginning of the Masechta, that needed a lachi or a kaira or both, depending who you hold like, and it fell down on Shabbos, it stays mutter for the entire Shabbos. Okay, what's the case of something which is forbidden in the beginning of Shabbos and stays forbidden the entire Shabbos even though the circumstances change? That's if you have two houses across Rosh Hashanah from each other, and the Goyim come on Shabbos and build a fence, creating a courtyard between the two houses that's blocked off from Rosh Hashanah. Since it started Shabbos so you can't carry in that yard, and the reason there is because you didn't make an Erev Chatzeris in the beginning of Shabbos. You couldn't make an Erev Chatzeris in the beginning of Shabbos. The yard didn't exist, and you cannot make an Erev Chatzeris now because you couldn't make one in the beginning of Shabbos at all. Now, what is the second case? Where you had a yard in which there was a couple of residents, there was a couple of Jews and a Goy. The Goy didn't make an Erev Chatzeris, he's not allowed to. He can't do Bittul Rishus either. The only thing you can do is Schiras Rishus. You didn't do Schiras Rishus, and therefore you couldn't carry in that yard. But then on Shabbos, the guy died. Still, it doesn't help the fact that the guy is no longer there. Even if you have a Erev Chatzeres existing, the guy's presence at the beginning of Shabbos makes it forbidden in the beginning of Shabbos to use that Erev Chatzeres and carry in the yard, and therefore you can't carry in the yard anytime throughout that continuing Shabbos. Now, it says here that the only exception, and this is the point, this is the raya, the only exception is Bittul Rishos, but it doesn't say Bittul Rishos, it says somebody who is Mavatal his Rishos. So you see that the person who is Mavatal his Rishos, the person who could have done an Erev Chatzeres in the beginning of Shabbos, and he didn't, he could be Mavatal his Rishus. That's what it seems to imply. It says the exception is the Mavatal Rishus, the guy who could have done it and he didn't. That's where you can change things on Shabbos by doing Bittul Rishus. But that seems to indicate that somebody else, somebody who couldn't do Bittul Rishus in the beginning of Shabbos, cannot. So Gemara says it's not a proof at all. All we're trying to say is that the concept of Bittul Rishus is you could change an Isser to a Heter on Shabbos. It doesn't have to be that person. Bittul Rishus is changing an Isser to a Heter. Doesn't matter who it is, if it's the person himself or it's not the person himself. Okay, now we bring the second proof, and this is from a brayso that says the following halach. What happens if somebody dies in the Chatzar? One of the residents dies just before Shabbos or after Shabbos has begun. So there's two halves of this brayso. The first brayso is where you have somebody who's a member of the Chatzar and he made an Erev Chatzeres. He did everything he's supposed to do, but then he died, and his inheritor did not make an Erev Chatzeres. So if he died before Shabbos, and he doesn't make an Erev Chatzeres, now you have somebody living here who didn't make an Erev Chatzeres, so it's a problem. If, however, he died on Shabbos, so Shabbos began, the original owner was alive, and there was a full-fledged Erev Chatzeres, everything is mutter, even though he dies on Shabbos, and the new owner didn't join the Erev Chatzeres, that's okay. Second half of the brayso says, you have the opposite. You have somebody who did not join Erev Chatzeres, who owns, and then he dies, and he leaves over, he bequeaths the inheritance to another member of the yard. So now what happens? So the Gemara says that if he died before Shabbos began, so that member of the yard could go, and he now becomes the owner, and he made an Erev Chatzeres. So everything's fine, because even though the original person didn't make an Erev Chatzeres, but the new owner, who took ownership before Shabbos began, he has an Erev Chatzeres. If, however, he dies after Shabbos began, then it's Aser, because Shabbos began with an owner, the original owner, still alive, and he didn't join the Erev Chatzeres. Therefore, it stays Aser for the rest of Shabbos. So the Gemara asks, why does it stay Aser? Let the new person do Bittul Rishus. Obviously, you can't do Bittul Rishus unless you were the original owner. The Gemara says, no, what do we mean to say when we say that it's Aser is that he Asers. There is a problem. The fact that the original owner didn't join the Erev Chatzeres is a problem. If he wants to do a Bittul Rishus, he could do Bittul Rishus. All we're saying is that it's Aser until he does Bittul Rishus.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.